Hello, everybody. How are you guys? I'm getting so many requests to follow through on a video I've been talking about doing about the history of the Pittsburgh PitStops, the long beloved NBA team here in Pittsburgh that folded in 2007. One of the original teams when the NBA formed in 1946. Now, technically, the NBA was 1949, but they were under a different name for 3 years, beginning in 1946. So we just call it all one time period. And before that, they were in the PitStops were in the Allegheny Monongahela League from 1912 on. And in those days, you have to remember, basketball itself was invented in what late 1800s. So the game, the sport, wasn't that old when the PitStops began as a team. I mean, if you could imagine. So it was kind of a wild. Those early days were kind of wild. The first professional league of any kind was the National Basketball League in 1898. Just to give you an idea of the context of the time, it was like the Trenton Nationals, the Camden Electrics, that kind of team. It was Eastern Focus, Bristol, the Bristol Pile Drivers. Of course, the original Celtics were from that era, and they were prominent actually as a team in that era. They were considered, probably the best team of that time. And then later, like in the 20s and 30s, you had all kinds of leagues. You had the Metropolitan Basketball League, started in 1921. You had the American Basketball League, founded in 25. There was the Eastern Basketball League. That was the one founded in 1909. That was a little earlier. And then when basketball spread, it really spread through the colleges. So you did, here in town, you had Pittsburgh had a team, University of Pittsburgh had a team, Duquesne had a team, as did Carnegie Mellon. Now, Carnegie Mellon's team wasn't that good. They were mostly, the problem with the Carnegie Mellon team in those days, when the game started, they had a hard time getting the starting five to go out on the court because they were more interested in, because the game was so new, the sport was still new. The Carnegie Mellon players were more interested in running mathematical models from the side of the court. So the coach would say, "Get in there," and the players have out their protractors and they're busy running some calculations just because they found the game so fascinating, which I understand. The game is full of, arcs and loops and a lot of things that would intrigue the scientific mind. And so the PitStops were born into this era, right? And when you look at that league, that Allegheny Monongahela League, I mean, they had teams in Greensburg. They had, so the teams didn't have to be just on those rivers, right? It just was a moniker for the area. So they had some teams in Ohio, like Steubenville. They had a Wheeling team down in West Virginia, a Morgantown, West Virginia team. So you can get the idea of the range of the league. Altoona, right? There's an Erie team, and Ashtabula, went to Newcastle, right? So there was a number of teams throughout. You could just say basically Western Pennsylvania, really. And so even though Pittsburgh was one of the bigger markets in those teams, in those days, sometimes smaller cities had better and bigger teams and bigger followings because the game was so new. And when you live in Morgantown, for example, the local basketball team is a big deal. Whereas in Pittsburgh, they had other things going on. This is a major city even then, so they had lots of attractions, lots of things to do. So So the leagues were different. That's the same case with the NFL. In the early days of the NFL, they had it was very focused in the Ohio Valley. They had a pretty big team in Portsmouth, Ohio. Pretty popular and big team there. They had a team in Ironton called the Ironton Tanks, and they were popular. So that's the same world or similar setup in the Allegheny Monongahela League. Some of those small towns had prominent teams that were as popular and probably had as much revenue or more than the Pittsburgh PitStops. So they competed and weren't as good as, say, the Celtics were in their league. They weren't a number one team. They weren't a top team. In fact, they really weren't a top team for most of their existence. But they were not one of the worst teams. They weren't a bottom. They weren't a cellar dweller. They weren't the Jacksonville Jaguars of the NFL. They weren't a perennial cellar dweller. So sometimes they would do well, and that would give the owners and the fans reason to believe that they'll overcome that hump and become a championship team like the Celtics, but it never really happened. I mean, of that level, and they never became a perennial winner. But they were not perennial losers. Just one of those middling teams that really are fun to go to. They're good teams. They're just not great teams. The Los Angeles Clippers. That kind of team. Or you might really, before LeBron, you could even say the Cavs, that sort of team. But I would say that's most of the teams in professional sports. Most of the teams in professional sports just find this middle ground, and they never become great, Super Bowl winning, NBA championship winning great, but they never hit the bottom. And some players play at those teams for their whole lives, and they have great careers, make good money. The teams have respectable but not super great winning and losing records, and life goes on. So, basketball was still developing its fan base, and here in Pittsburgh, there were some core followers. Sometimes the pit stops would be in one bus on the road trips down to Morgantown or whatever, and the fans would be in the other bus, the core fans. There'd be, not that many more fans than there were players following on the bus. And the fan bus would be weaving a little because, they had a few refreshments before the game, but they would follow the pit stops all over these hills and hollers of western Pennsylvania throughout the winter. And it's funny because basketball itself was invented. The guy that invented basketball invented it as a way to train and keep in shape athletes during the winter months. Because you had the hockey, of course, but it still was not a major sport. And so you had, for your basic American athlete at a university in the East Coast, you had baseball and football. And so he invented the game as a way to keep them limber and loose and in shape during the winter. And, of course, it developed into its own major sport that we know today. So the pit stops, like a lot of teams in those days, were constantly fighting budget shortfalls. It just wasn't enough revenue that's expensive. To have a team is really expensive. There's a league now called I think it's the ABA, and it's not the old ABA. There's the Yellow City, the Steel City Yellow Jackets are in the ABA, the American Basketball Association, which leases that name, or they have they pay the NBA to use that name because the NBA got the rights to that phraseology and that branding when they absorbed the league. the original league. So, they originally had a franchise investment fee of like $50,000, and that kept the league to like six teams because not a lot of investors are going to pony up that kind of money. So that league, originally they were in major cities, but then they quickly had to reorganize because it wasn't working, and they opened it up to smaller cities, and then they lowered the investment fee for franchise owners to $10,000, which now there's like 30 teams, I think. But nonetheless, those teams are constantly struggling, and so you see what I'm saying? It's no matter what era, no matter what league, unless you're the top international league like the NBA, it's a struggle, man. It's very hard to get fans out and to get a following and stay solvent. Not to mention paying the players. It's a professional league. You have to pay the players, and there was at one time in Canada, some of the amateur leagues were paying their players $8 a game. So I'm not sure it wasn't that different in the early days of the pit stops. That they were professional basketball players, but the professional part, the paid part, was very minimal. And so most of them had jobs on the side as teachers, as steel workers, as janitors, as street cleaners, right? Maybe they sold insurance on the side, whatever it took, to be able to play the game they loved. So the pit stops, that's the context of the era that they started in. And slowly, though, over time, decade by decade, they grew and grew. And like a lot of teams developed generational followings. Grandpa was a pit stop fan, father was a pit stop fan, son, or, grandma, mom, and daughter, all along. It just, the home has the flags, the banners out every game, and they go to the games, and it becomes a community, a family and community thing, just like any major sports team. So they had their core. Basketball's an exciting sport, and when you have a sports-loving team like this town, it's not that hard to get a core, and once you have that core, it grows over time. And the team was pretty good. They weren't great, but they were pretty good. And we've highlighted a lot of the players already in this video series. Probably, I think, we're up to 12 fan favorites. We're focused on fan favorites because it's interesting players from the past. And we'll do a lot more. There's for however many decades the pit stops were in existence, that's a lot of players. So there's a lot of cool, fun players in the Pittsburgh pit stops history that we can talk about, and we will. So let me see. So does that? I'm just trying to give you a general idea of how they started, why they started, what the league was like, how much the players got paid. You just got to picture America in that. There's that 1910 to 12 era when they started was right before World War I. To give you an idea how far back it went. And plus, like I said, the sport itself wasn't that old. Just a few years before that, when they first invented the game, it was they nailed peach baskets to the wall of the gym, to the balcony of the gym. That was the original basketball. In other words, the baskets were actual baskets, and they would stop the practice, stop the game for the janitor to get on the ladder and get the basketball out of the basket to continue play. Well, then the next innovation was they drilled a hole in the bottom of they poked a hole in the bottom of the basket so that then they can get the basket out faster by snapping it out of there, poking it out of there with a broom handle. Well, why don't they just, it just seems obvious that within one day you would say, well, let's just cut the bottom out of the basket. But nonetheless, they eventually got to that point. They cut the bottom out of the basket, and it became. And then by 1909, they had, or not 1906, they had steel rims and actual nets, and backboards, and the game developed from there. And then the pit stops were born into that era, and grew and grew. Now this is just a thumbnail sketch of what those guys were all about, and we'll get more into detail of their history, the owners. We're doing some of the players already, some of the original players. They're so much fun. There's such great characters on the pit stops over the years. Listen to some of those videos just prior to this one, and watch them, and I think you get a kick out of it. You get a laugh. Yeah, and then if you have specific questions about the pit stops early days or history through 2007, leave a comment, and then I'll address the comments in future videos. And it's really a shame as I'm telling the story, I'm like shaking my head, like, man, it's such a shame when a team of that caliber and that length of history folds due to a crazy story of political intrigue, criminal activity, profit-taking, greed, political infighting, the usual. In Los Angeles, we call that Monday. No. So we'll get into that. That's a crazy story, and maybe a warning, a word of warning story to potential owners of Major League sports teams. But hey, that's half the fun, man. It's the crazy owners and all that stuff. So come back for more.